Welcome to the launch of Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman. I'm the associate editor of The Sun, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rebecca Sugar, who's a columnist for us. We know that the news can make you crazy, and so Rebecca and I are here every week to help you make sense out of the nonsense and bring some sanity to the news.
Happy launch.
Thrilled to be here.
Yeah, me too. And, in the spirit of our launch, I came up with a quote that I pulled about sanity that I thought would sort of set the table for all of us. It's by author Dorinda Jones, who said, "I often question my sanity. Occasionally, it replies." So we hope, Ari and I, that we are the reply for all of you and bring some sanity every Friday to your home.
Great. And let's dive into it, Rebecca. Our top story for today is the so-called constitutional crisis. I first became aware of this crisis when I opened up some rival publications, I must admit, the New York Times, the top of the paper, blaring headline, "We're in a constitutional crisis." I open up CNN, blaring headline, "We're in a constitutional crisis." And the issue is, are we really? And if we were, is this what it would feel like? Let's start with what we know. We know that President Trump has moved fast. We know that he's issued a blizzard of executive orders, and he aims at an ambitious renovation of the federal government. Now, the question is, can he do that? And my hunch is it's going to really depend on a case-by-case basis. One thing to get out of the way is just because you lose in court doesn't mean you're in the middle of a constitutional crisis, right?
Right. So maybe you're the legal mind between us. I love it if you would just explain to everybody from a legal standpoint, what is the definition of a constitutional crisis?
I'd say we know that we're in a constitutional crisis if an order from a court is flagrantly disregarded. Right? There's an old saying about the law that behind every law is the muzzle of a gun. The meaning is that the law is enforced. The law is the government's prerogative to enforce. So if we had a Supreme Court decision that was blatantly ignored, I think we would be plunged into a crisis. But the regular back and forth of litigation, can the president freeze spending? Can he abolish U.S. aid? Can he abolish the education department? These aren't sort of crises. These are how presidents jockey to get their agenda through the courts.
Right. So let me ask you then, during the Biden administration, when the Supreme Court ruled that he could not cancel student loan debt, and then he famously went on camera and said, "I'm basically going to, I don't like that decision, I'm going to do it anyway." Were we in a constitutional crisis then? And maybe the bigger question is, from a legal standpoint, what does it mean to be in a constitutional crisis? What are the implications of being in one?
Right. For sure. So President Biden had this ambitious plan to basically forgive $1 trillion in student loan debt. That was nixed by the court, who said the president doesn't have that ability. These were legally binding contracts. A presidential pen can't just make that go away. And the administration found various workarounds to forgive not as many loans as they hoped to, but sort of enough to amount to a significant outlay of federal funds. But even more than that, right? Representative Ocasio-Cortez went on television and said that people should ignore a ruling from a federal judge about the abortion pill. Famously, Chuck Schumer stood on the steps in D.C. and said, about an adverse abortion ruling that the court had released the whirlwind and would feel its consequences. President Biden proposed ending lifetime tenure at the court and passing an amendment negating presidential immunity. So the battle between president and the courts is an old one. We have an editorial out where we talk about Abraham Lincoln clashed with the Chief Justice of his time, and so did Andrew Jackson. So there's nothing new about this, and maybe that's kind of back to where we started, where if you can't be in a crisis if you're always in a crisis. Or if you're always in a crisis, maybe it's not really a crisis.
Right. And then I guess my next question is it one directional, a constitutional crisis, only if the executive or member of Congress ignores the order of a court? Or could it be, as I see it in this case, where a judge sort of ignored the authority of the executive, which it seems to plainly have in this case, and then attorneys general sued Is that a constitutional crisis, but coming from the other direction? Meaning, are they stepping into a lane that they don't belong in and causing a constitutional crisis?
It's a great way of putting it, Rebecca, because, of course, in the Constitution's design, these are co-equal branches, right? So it's not like the judges are the adults in the room and the executive are the kids and the adults get to make all the rules, that there's responsibilities and limitations and powers that go, it's a two-way street. I think a lot of the tension around this has accumulated around the idea of an injunction. Injunction is basically when a federal judge or a state judge says, this has to stop. It's a temporary halt. It's not a decision on the final decision, but it's a temporary order that freezes things in place. Now, it's a quirk of our system that an injunction issued by one federal judge anywhere can block something from going into effect everywhere. And you're starting to see, on behalf of J.D. Vance and some others, people starting to question that system. And now sometimes it's Republican judges who do it and sometimes liberal judges do it. And so I wonder if we might see real effort to sort of get rid of the idea of a quote unquote nationwide injunction.
Yeah.
And whether appellate courts will sort of crack down on district courts doing this. I think, to zoom out a little bit, in Trump's first term, we saw the so-called resistance to Trump take the form of street protests, and other means. Now those have died. It seems now that the courts have become the primary battleground for the administration. Now, my sense is that, and from reporting I've done, that Trump is playing the long game here. I mean, he has 4 years. Some of these efforts are going to be stymied. The question is, can he get enough of them through and enough of them to the Supreme Court where he can rack up lasting victories?
Right. And it feels like just this morning, another federal judge, or was it the same federal judge, who said, who sort of pulled back on this TRO, this temporary restraining order against DOGE and the president. And I didn't actually legally understand what he was getting at, but what he basically said, right, was, no, I don't have the authority to stop the president from deciding on how to spend the money or hiring and firing. He can't, full scale just negate the entire budget and just say, I'm not going to spend what Congress has said should be spent. But he has this period of time to assess and audit and evaluate. But the TRO still remains. So how could it still remain if what was he trying to say this morning? And was he maybe sensing that the law was not on his side?
Right. And the nature of these TROs is that they're temporary. And so they can only remain in effect if they fulfill, at least theoretically, a really stringent set of requirements. Mostly they have to be preventing, and this is the legal term, irreparable harm. And so you have to show at every instance that if the restraining order is not in place, that irreparable harm will ensue. And so they're kind of, there's not these can't stay on the books for months. They have a quick expiration period before the case has to kind of mature. I will say one of the issues that's being sort of spotlit here is that our government is hybrid in sort of strange ways. By that I mean that even executive agencies have this kind of like weird congressional DNA in them. So for example, the Education Department, which is sort of the next big fight here, was established by an act of Congress. That's going to make it tough for Trump to get rid of it. Right. I think Trump is on sort of the weakest ground with this effort to fire these independent inspectors generals. Now, regardless of what you think, whether there should be these kind of free agents roaming around presidential departments, they were established by acts of Congress. And so the thinking would be it probably would need an act of Congress to get rid of them. Congress is in no position to do anything. So the question is, how much leeway will the courts give Trump to get the executive branch he wants?
Right. Okay, so to close out our constitutional crisis, non-crisis segment, just help us understand, if we were in fact in a constitutional crisis, which I think we're both saying we are clearly not, but were we in one, what would happen next? What do you do when you're in a constitutional crisis? Do you impeach the president? Do you put people in jail? Or is it just a nice talking point?
It's a great question of what a crisis would look like. I think, again, it would have to be a clear disregard for a court order. The question of how then would the court enforce its order is difficult to imagine, because, of course, the executive branch is the branch that's supposed to enforce that. And would it enforce something against itself? That appears unlikely. I would sort of encourage folks, though, to kind of take a step back a little bit and recognize that there's some really interesting legal questions here. And I think by getting into a mindset of crisis and hair on fire, we kind of miss that. I've done some writing about the birthright citizenship question. That's a juicy constitutional question that the Supreme Court is eventually going to take. So our system allows for litigation. It allows for controversy. That's the measure of a case is there a controversy? So let's let things play out, and we'll see how things work on appeal, and we'll see where we are. My sense is that Trump is not really eager for that kind of crisis. I mean, I think a lot of these are opening gambits, and we'll see what happens, and we'll see what works.
Well, since you brought it up, let's just talk about the birthright citizenship thing just for a minute, and maybe we'll talk about it another time too. But that seemed to me like the weakest of them all, because it seems plain, the language about being born in the United States and being a citizen. So Trump's lawyers are not unaware of that. So what do you think their strategy is here? Do they want it to go to the Supreme Court, and for what reason? Right.
Listen, birthright citizenship has had a tough go so far. I think 3 judges have said this is blatantly unconstitutional. There's no way this flies. I've done some reporting on that, and we actually had an exclusive in The Sun suggesting that a new legal theory is emerging. And the idea is that the 14th Amendment says that those who are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States get birthright citizenship. Right? So who does that exclude? That excludes diplomats. If you've ever tried to park in the city and a car has a diplomat license, they're not getting a ticket. There's no jurisdiction there. It included at the time Native Americans who weren't citizens. They were citizens of their own tribes. It excluded kind of foreign forces, right? If you're a soldier of France and you happen to be here, your allegiance is not to America, it's to the Fifth Republic. But the question is, would it include illegal aliens? Because they're not part of that social compact, right? I mean, the idea of jurisdiction is you exchange allegiance for protection. And almost by definition, they came here illegally. They broke some law. So it's a little bit of a Hail Mary theory, but people said that about Roe v. Wade and other cases, and I think there's more here than meets the eye. And if you're at all contrarian and everybody is saying this is a done deal, that's when you want to start paying attention.
Right. Okay, I'm sure we'll talk about that in a future show.
Absolutely.
So sanity check number 1, there is no constitutional crisis.
I think we're
as
good.
Per A.R. Hoffman and Rebecca Sugar.
You heard it here first.
Okay, great. Good to know. Moving on to our next segment called Make It Make Sense. DOGE, which is really a related conversation to everything we were just talking about. And of course, there was that really interesting press conference between President Trump and Elon Musk and little X on his shoulders. And so much talk about what DOGE has been doing to sort of audit these various departments in the federal government. And I don't think we have to go through all the, trans opera stuff, that's been reported, and some of the more serious, I think, wastes of money and abuses of money that have been discovered, and more will come. I think we want to sort of step back and take a larger view of what this all means. We just had an EO this morning. Again, things happen so quickly that as we're starting the show, we're sort of checking our phones to see what we should actually be talking about. But another EO this morning to establish that DOGE officers will be installed into these various departments and be reporting back monthly so that we know what's going on. So maybe just start with the bigger question of, I don't know, how does DOGE make R.A. Hoffman feel? Because everybody has a different feeling about it. But what do you think?
Sure. You're absolutely right to say that DOGE has kind of become a sort of stand-in for the ways in which Trump is moving against the federal bureaucracy. And so I think when we say DOGE, we mean a whole set of things. And I think what's missing from the conversation, which is why we're giving it to you here, is really a question not so much of the nitty-gritty of DOGE, but kind of like, what does this mean in terms of the American system of government? it's a tribute to DOGE's success that now everybody says that, well, there's a lot of waste and we need reform. Nobody was saying that before DOGE. So I think that's important to get out of the way.
Peter Schweizer was saying it, in all fairness. Peter, if you're out there.
Some folks, yes. But even
Mike
now,
Benz.
Democrats and, so that would be an argument for, sunlight as the best disinfectant, right? That you kind of like assemble a set of facts that cause people to change their mind, and that's good. The questions I have are ones of sort of hammer versus scalpel, or let's put it like pistol versus bazooka. There's no doubt that there was a tremendous amount of waste. On the other hand, I'm a big believer in America as a force for good in the world, that our interests are everywhere, and that going back to JFK in 1960, whatever, that soft power is real power. And so I worry about the vacuum. I worry about sort of moving fast and breaking too many things, and leaving China and other actors, Russia, whoever, an opportunity to kind of pick up all the pieces. I also think that, I wish we could have found a way to cabin off the sort of, let's call them cultural programs that USAID was doing, and the sort of health programs. I think programs like PEPFAR, programs like some research and other things were just good programs. I mean, they're good things to do, just like, everyone should give a little bit of philanthropy. I think that America should kind of work to make people's lives better.
Right. I think it does bring up this question of what is our role in the world and who's thinking that through. This USAID situation, Samantha Power, feel like nobody was thinking anything through, or maybe they were thinking other kinds of things through that had very little to do with what was in America's best interest, and had a lot to do with their own personal interests, their relationships, and their own ideologies. And so that's a separate issue. But I think as we're talking about rebuilding USAID under a different name or putting it in the State Department, I think it's critically important to think about America's national interest. And I would say even when we are doing those projects that you're talking about, which are good, there can be waste in good things too. And again, this is not the government's money. This is the money of the American people. And if you can spend $100 to cure AIDS in a child in Africa and not $500 to do it, the former is the preference, because it's in America's national interest to keep as much of our money in our pockets as possible. And I think we've completely lost sight of that. So I don't want to lose sight of that, however we rebuild this thing. And I agree about soft power. And I also worry that there are things that these agencies were built to fund via NGOs and other entities that a lot of people would think are maybe not so good, or they'd be really uncomfortable if they knew they were happening, but might also be in America's national interest. And so who makes those decisions? How much transparency Americans should have and would want to have, and what that transparency would do to the ability to operate in these ways across the world, are all questions that I don't hear us having a lot of conversations about. We're so stuck on the sort of, trans-opera stuff.
Right. And the question of first principles, I think where you have to start is, what is America's role in the world? What is the point of foreign aid? I think it's no coincidence that DOGE started with USAID. I think because it's a foreign program, because it was obvious there was this waste. And it's also, people say it's 1% of the federal government. It's kind of one of those interesting statistics where that can feel kind of small. 1% of anything isn't a ton, but also kind of big. I mean, 1% of a Leviathan is 1% of a Leviathan. So it's kind of like become, I think, an interesting test case. I'm just like a real American patriot. Like, I really don't think a world without America is a better world. And I think wherever America is, I'd hope that makes any situation better. Now, if it wasn't doing that, we need to sort of address that.
Right. And it's conceivable, I think we've talked about this before, that, in some of these cases where it looks like we're moving into a country to do good, we might actually be doing the opposite, right? Like where we go into these conservative Middle Eastern countries or Eastern European countries and have, gay pride, professional development for their, governmental staff, and they don't want that. And in a sense, our intent to do good.
We might disagree a little bit on this. I mean, I do think that, I want to live in a world where, nobody is killed for being gay. And so, the sort of...
We don't disagree on that, just to be clear.
No. But meaning that, a program that would look out of place in San Francisco might be doing important work in, Zambia or something, right? Now, it should be tailored for the Zambian context, right? And maybe a better way to do that is not to have some random USAID program, but the president calling up the country and say, I don't actually know if Uganda is a great example.
Yeah.
If you keep executing gay people, you're not getting a cent of money, and you're going to be a pariah, right?
That's
so maybe there are other
probably
levers.
More effective than just waving flags and having Pride Day in a place that doesn't want it. Right. So again, good intentions and good outcomes are not the same thing.
Right. I mean, one bigger question is, I think there's no doubt that Musk is attacking this with energy, with his trademark kind of indomitable personality. I'm starting to hear of friends of mine who are being called down to work with DOGE, sort of very on the DL. But I think this is something that is attractive to a lot of people who aren't MAGA Republicans, and I think that's a sign of its broad appeal. And we'll see where it happens. I think in a way it was kind of brilliant for Trump to sort of deputize all this to Musk, right? It creates this almost kind of, Trump can do like the things Trump likes. Trump's never a details guy. Like he doesn't want to do any of this stuff, right?
Yes.
And he can kind of like whatever. And it's actually an amazing act, kind of savvy act of delegation.
Yes.
Right?
Well, okay. And what do you think about just the political implications of the Democrats mostly going so hard against Musk and the DOGE efforts, almost as if to call attention to the fact that they've been wasting our money all this time and would like to keep doing it? What are they thinking? Are they just desperately afraid of what is yet to be revealed? What is this?
Yeah, I think Democrats are in a tough position. I mean, first, the opposing party, the party out of power, is always in a tough position. But Democrats are kind of flailing to me. I mean, the real core question that they have to sort out is, will they work with Trump or not? And that doesn't mean that they're all of a sudden going to put on red hats, but it means, is their posture one of absolute defiance, or is it sort of, we kind of have to budge a little bit? And that's a tough choice. It's a tough choice for a party that's out of power. I will say I truly don't see the upside in coming behind the federal bureaucracy, right? It's a famous thing of, the scariest words in the English language, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. Right. And even if you don't really believe that, nobody loves going to the DMV. Nobody loves doing their taxes. Right. And so it's just a strange side to pick. It's like you're watching the Super Bowl and you're like cheering for the referees. Like nobody really cares, right? That's not a winning position.
Right. So we can't diagnose them, is what you're saying. It's actual insanity to be taking. I get resisting Trump. That's what they're built to do. But I would not have chosen to resist this. Well,
I think part of the problem with the Democrats, and I hope we devote a future episode just to the Democrats, is that they become sort of really captured by these groups, right? And so it's not just, I think, that they're it's knee-jerk opposition. It's that somehow their constituent kind of members are themselves interested in a lot of these unpopular positions, organizations, and causes. And so it's become very difficult for them to detach themselves from that and kind of, it's not brains, just look at the polls and look at people's support for these efforts, and it's through the roof.
Yes, and I don't have TikTok, and I'm sure they don't watch little shorts on X, but whatever media, social media they're following, you see tons of these short videos of all of the people in the groups that you're describing that the Democrats felt were part of their coalition. And whatever that racial, ethnic, socioeconomic identity is, it's always trumped by, you're taking my money and stealing it and giving it to ridiculous things. And so they're not winning those groups. There are lots of, Black women who are traditionally Democratic voters screaming about money that didn't go to them and their children, and that went $59 million to hotel rooms for illegal immigrants. They don't like it either. So it's literally, our podcast is called Sanity. I don't see any in the Democratic push to push against Trump and DOGE.
I agree. I mean, the only kind of, if I were like the voice of Greek tragedy or like Sophocles, I'll say that, there's the danger of hubris is ever present. And, I think the Democrats went too far in terms of cultural politics, and to call it woke, call it DI, all of that. I don't know if people want kind of a demolished federal government. It's not even clear what that would mean, but I don't know. I just a word of caution, that there's always the possibility of overreach. I don't think people are going to mourn USAID, but there are, I think, questions of, as crises arise down the line, are we retaining enough basic competency to deal with things as they come up?
Right.
This section is called Tipping Point, where we talk about something that feels like it's at an inflection, that could go either of two ways, fork in the road. Today, we'll talk about Mar-a-Gaza. Just a little bit ago, Trump announced his intention, I think shocked everyone, including Benjamin Netanyahu, kind of a plan for America to take over the coastal enclave, rebuild it, move Gazans out. We don't really have more details than that. That's kind of the vague idea. And I think a lot of people, Rebecca, expected it to be walked back the next day. But it really hasn't. It's kind of, again, we don't know the details fulsomely, but Trump's sticking with it. And he brought it up during a meeting with King Abdullah of Jordan, and it's now sort of has a kind of sticking power. What do you think?
Yeah, look, for me, it calls to mind 2016 when Ann Coulter was on the Bill Maher show and with a panel of guests talking about who would be the Republican nominee. And everyone went down the line and named whoever they named, Marco Rubio, whoever they said. And Ann, I think straight to camera, said Donald Trump. And just uproarious laughter ensued. She was mocked for weeks in the media. And of course, she was exactly right. And that's how I felt in that moment watching that, when Trump first said those words about taking Palestinians out, moving them to, I don't know, Albania or Swaziland or wherever the places are. It wasn't Swaziland, but an equivalent.
I don't think Swaziland exists
anymore. But, well, he might create one. You never know. Right. But I had that same feeling of this sounded insane at first blush, and then I thought that's exactly what he's going to try to do. Again, no details, no idea exactly what that looks like, but doesn't mean it won't happen. And I've seen hints more and more in the days that have followed that something like that is maybe more likely than not to happen.
Right. And one thing to note is that if you piss off Thomas Friedman, you're doing something right. And of course, we love you, Tom, but he's come out against it. So I think that's right. I think what Trump intuits more than most is that, especially in a conflict in the Middle East, there's kind of a battle of concepts and a battle of ideas. And oftentimes the reality is kind of downstream from those sort of paradigm shifts, not only in the Middle East, but elsewhere as well. So I think what Trump is saying, the idea of Gaza has been discredited as it is presently constituted, or was presently constituted, and we need a new idea. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, there's been a year and a half of war. Nobody has any other ideas. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying that means that this is the best idea since sliced bread, but I mean that it is a genuinely new, Bibi called it a revolutionary idea, and maybe it provides an opening, maybe it cracks open the Overton window to sort of think in ways that actually make sense. The idea of Hamas-led Gaza is a non-starter. It's over.
Right.
It's over. And you go from there.
Agree. And I think it's also sort of brought to the fore a lot of the hypocrisies that we've all just lived with and ignored for so long, right? I mean, if this is a population of refugees and their descendants living in an open-air prison, as has often been said, Well, if they're refugees, then why do they need to stay on that particular piece of land? That's never really been fully thought through.
Right.
And if
it can't be both a homeland and a refugee camp.
Exactly.
Those two things can coexist.
Exactly. And if it is an open-air prison, why, I think according to Palestinian polls recently, up to 30% said that if given the chance to leave, they would. Who's imprisoning them? Not the Israelis and not the Americans. So there are a lot of these sort of issues that we've all just sort of not dealt with as we've been focused on this two-state solution fantasy for the last several years, that now, because of what Trump just said, get cracked open and we kind of have to confront them.
Right. And, it really spotlights the role of Egypt and to a lesser extent Jordan in all of this. Now, I get their positions. I mean, they don't want to take hundreds of thousands or a million refugees. It would totally destabilize their societies. But that kind of begs the question, okay, then what do you do here? Mm-hmm. Millions of Syrians have been absorbed in different countries, not very successfully, honestly,
yes.
if you look at Germany and elsewhere.
Yes.
So this is a real problem. But the idea of a enclave that had been turned into basically a terror state mm-hmm. and a terror launching pad cannot be allowed to continue.
Right. So what do you think of Trump's sort of high noon statement about Saturday and giving a deadline, a timeline? And Netanyahu was in Hebrew speaking about that. I just saw it before we came on, reiterating that, that is the deadline. And the deadline for what? For all hell to break loose. So what does all hell break loose look like? And what do you think that does to this whole conversation? Right.
I mean, that's another extraordinary example where Trump has kind of like, been more Catholic than the Pope or more Jewish than the rabbi. I mean, Bibi at this point is, looks like, moderate or
Remember Meir Kahane, the sort of
of course,
reviled right-wing fanatic that everybody hated. This was his idea. Yeah. And now Trump is sort of parroting his idea of removing Palestinians from Gaza.
Yeah. And, I do think Israel has to hold its own counsel a little bit. I mean, Trump is a roller coaster ride, and certainly there was some report that the Israeli cabinet is now like high on Trump, and I would, I think for sure it's a big boon for Bibi. It's a big boon for his coalition. It's a big boon for the Israeli right. But I do think that Trump was affected by the images of the hostages released. I mean, and Trump said it looked like Holocaust videos.
It did.
Let's call it what it is.
Yes.
And there was something about the arrogance of that, the depravity, the audacity on the part of Hamas that I think was just sort of enough. And this drip drab of hostages being released was becoming awful. Now, we all want hostages home, but this process was becoming a mockery.
Right.
And so, give up what you have.
Right. I think that's right. I think everybody was horrified by what they saw. Maybe.
I mean, each one was worse than the next. You had the mob around, the girls, and then you had this, strange ceremony or whatever, and then you just have these people being released, and the cruelty of making, I forgot his name, but someone say,
Sharabi.
I want to see my wife and daughters, and they'd been murdered on October 7th. Yes. That's a level of kind of a theater of the cruel that's almost difficult to imagine. And so when people are outraged by Trump's, plan for Gaza, I get all that, but you have to start with what we're seeing.
Yes.
And this is not an entity that is should be allowed to rule a territory.
Right. And the feeling, of course,
they forfeited
that other hostages who were meant to be released are being delayed precisely because Hamas now understands how damning those images were, and the other hostages may be in even worse condition, which is hard to even conceive.
Yeah, we don't want to, but we don't know. But,
we don't know.
And I can so see if you're a family member of a hostage who was slated to be released, and now you're thrown into doubt and turmoil. I mean, I can't imagine really what that feels like.
Right.
But there is the prospect that the war will restart.
While we're on the subject of hostages, I just think it's worth noting, and we should say that an American hostage was released, is it this morning or yesterday, this morning? Mm-hmm. Mark Fogel, who had been held in Russia for the last 3.5 years in a penal colony he was caught in the airport. He's a teacher. He was teaching at an American school in Moscow, and he was detained for having, I think, less than an ounce of medical marijuana. Mm. Thrown into this penal colony, 14-year sentence, and was finally released. And again, a very different hostage situation. I don't want to compare them at all. He did not come back looking like a Holocaust survivor, and not that he was a happy hostage, but it just reminds us that we just as we as Americans felt the joy and the pride of seeing that man returned home, hearing his 95-year-old mother would not die never to see her son free again, that just evoked so much emotion.
It was amazing scenes of him draped in an American flag, with the Steelers hat, and saying he feels like the luckiest person in the world.
Yes. So, I think Americans who see that and feel that swell of joy and pride can understand maybe just a little bit of what Israelis feel when their hostages come home, even in that hideous, horrible, unthinkable condition. It's a mixture, I'm sure, of joy and pride and also horror. But our minds should always be on what it means to be held hostage and then to be returned home.
Yeah. And, we were talking before about what is the purpose of government, what is the purpose of the state and expenditures and making the kind of the homeland obligation is to get your people back. I mean, that's the core of the contract.
Yes, right? Exactly right.
Our last section is going to be Sunburn. It'll be a rant about something in the news that really got us going this week. So, Rebecca, go ahead.
Oh, I'm first. Okay. I want to be appropriately outraged for mine. It's about Kier Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, who they've had in place now for, I think, over a year or two, the Online Safety Act, they call it, and which is I guess if you're a dictatorial, censorship-loving prime minister, it's your dream come true, this act. But if you're not, if you're somebody who actually likes free speech and doesn't want to go to jail for saying things that hurt other people's feelings, this has not been good for Britain. And so my sunburn is Kier Starmer, but the sunlight, the ray of sun here is that Donald Trump in recent negotiations with Britain over trade has made those negotiations conditional on the UK's revision of that act and lessening some of the insanity that's embedded within it. And in so doing, I think Trump has not only proven himself to be a guardian of free speech here in America, but around the Western world. And so Brits owe our president and our administration a big thank you for that one. And we all owe Kier Starmer a big boo for being, one of the worst prime ministers Britain's ever had.
The Starmer era has not been an inspiring one. And
that was polite.
And might not be a long one. Yeah, we'll see.
Hopefully.
My burn is, it's more of like a kind of throwing some shade, let's say. And that's about this whole Eric Adams prosecution. Now, there's some thought that the prosecution of Adams was political in the first place because of Adams' kind of changing tune on immigration. Be that as it may, the case was brought in the Southern District of New York. Word came just a couple of days ago that Trump the Trump DOJ is moving to dismiss those charges. The whole thing seems like a fiasco to me. If the case was never serious, it should never have been brought in the first place. The bar for bringing a case against a sitting mayor should be pretty high. And if it was serious, then I would have liked to see it play out. Trump could always pardon him after a verdict. He could always commute his sentence. He's president for 4 more years. It's not going anywhere. But the part of me that, likes to see, whether the Yankees come back in the bottom of the ninth, would have liked to see whether a jury would have brought in a verdict of innocent or guilty on Eric Adams. And we likely won't see that. So my sunburn is for the trial of Eric Adams that never was. That's all for us for Sanity today. We hope you'll join us again next week for another episode.
And please, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, subscribe so you never miss a show. And if you're watching us on YouTube, hit the like button and subscribe.